Come on, Ankit. We need to get going or the market will be too crowded. Grandfather called out from the courtyard. 12-year-old Ankit quickly tied his shoelaces and ran outside. There waiting for him was his daddy, as he lovingly called his grandfather, standing next to the old green Vespa scooter. Ankit smiled broadly when he saw the silver stickers spelling out Sarvagia still shining brightly on the front panel. The stickers he had put there himself many years ago when he first learned to spell. "All right, Daddy, let's go. I'll navigate." Ankit hopped onto the footrest of the scooter. His grandfather chuckled and turned the key in the ignition. The scooter sputtered to life. As they wove through the narrow streets of the small town, Ankit gazed around with wonder as he always did, taking in the colorful storefronts, the delicious aromas wafting from food carts, the crowds of people milling about. He loved these outings with his grandfather to the bazaar. It was their special tradition every summer when Ankit came to visit. "Look, Daddy, there's Mr. Sharma." Ankit pointed to a tall man with a thick mustache. "Can we stop and say hello?" "Of course, my boy." His grandfather pulled the Vespa over to the curb. "Good day, Mr. Sharma. How are you?" "Professor Sarvagia. A pleasure as always." The man greeted Ankit's grandfather respectfully. "And I see you have your young navigator with you again." He winked at Ankit. "That's right, he's the best co-pilot an old man could ask for," his grandfather said proudly, patting Ankit on the back. Ankit beamed with pride. He loved that everyone in town knew his daddy and showed him such regard. After all, his grandfather had been a respected professor of English literature at the local college for decades before retiring. And he was the wisest, kindest man Ankit had ever known. "All right, Mr. Sharma, we must be on our way now. The wife will have my head if I don't bring back her vegetables in time for lunch," Ankit's grandfather joked. Mr. Sharma laughed. "Well, we can't have that now, can we? Off you go then. Goodbye, Professor." "Goodbye, Ankit." They waved as the scooter puttered off again. "Daddy, can we please stop for samosas on the way back?" "Pretty please." Ankit clasped his hands together pleadingly. "You and your samosas." His grandfather shook his head in mock exasperation. "Very well, but don't tell your grandmother or she'll scold me for spoiling your appetite." "Yes, thank you, Daddy, you're the best." Ankit wrapped his arms around his grandfather's waist in a quick hug. These were the moments he lived for all year, the precious times spent with his beloved daddy, listening to his stories, soaking up his wisdom, basking in his love and approval. In the winters when Ankit was in Delhi attending school, he survived on these golden memories, played them over and over in his mind until summer rolled around again. If only he had known then how fleeting it would all be. If only he could have stopped the clock, frozen time in that perfect summer afternoon with the sun on his face and the wind in his hair as they zipped along on that trusted green scooter. His valiant steed, his magic carpet. But time waits for no one, not even for a boy and his grandfather. Ankit sat cross-legged on the floor of his grandfather's study, surrounded by boxes. 3 years had passed since that terrible day when he got the call about his daddy's passing. 3 years of a dull, hollow ache in his chest that never really went away. Now, as per his grandmother's wishes, he was sorting through his grandfather's belongings, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to throw away. It was a task he had been putting off, the finality of it too painful to face. But he couldn't avoid it forever. With a heavy sigh, he opened the first box. Books. So many books. His daddy had been a voracious reader, devouring everything from dense scholarly texts to spy thrillers to Urdu poetry. Ankit lightly ran a finger along the worn spines, remembering all the times he had seen his grandfather in this very room, reading for hours on end in his favorite armchair by the window. The books would be donated to the college library. That's what his daddy would have wanted. Ankit carefully closed the box and moved on to the next one. Old notebooks, journals, papers covered in his grandfather's careful handwriting. Poetic verses scribbled in the margins, profound insights jotted down whenever inspiration struck. His grandfather's brilliant mind, preserved on paper. These Ankit would keep. He couldn't bear to part with them. Hours passed as he methodically worked his way through the boxes. Mementos from his grandfather's teaching days, awards, gifts from students, framed photographs. Those would be split between Ankit and his father. Knickknacks and curios collected over a lifetime of travel: brass camels from Egypt, painted masks from Indonesia, a music box from Paris that played La Vie en Rose. Ankit would take a few to remember his daddy by, and the rest would be given away. As he opened the final box, his breath caught in his throat. Folded neatly on top was his grandfather's favorite cardigan, the soft blue one he always wore when he told Ankit stories. Ankit lifted it out gently, held it to his face, and inhaled deeply. Instantly, he was transported back in time. Sandalwood, old books, aftershave. The smells of his childhood, the smells of his daddy. Ankit's eyes burned with unshed tears. This cardigan, this would be his most cherished inheritance. A tangible piece of the man he loved and missed so terribly it was like a physical ache. Suddenly, an aged envelope fluttered out from between the cardigan folds and landed on the floor. Brow furrowed in confusion, Ankit picked it up and turned it over. There, written in his grandfather's distinct scrawl, was his own name. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Ankit," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. I hope you can forgive an old man's foolish romanticism in writing you this letter. But there are things I want to make sure you know." Tears blurred the words and spilled down Ankit's cheeks as he read the message his daddy had left behind for him. It was full of love, pride, life lessons, nuggets of hard-earned wisdom. With every line, he could hear his grandfather's gentle voice in his mind. "You have a light inside you, my boy, a goodness. Never let anyone or anything dim that light. Nurture it, share it with the world. For it's the only thing that drives out darkness. When life feels unbearable, look for the helpers. Be a helper. Throw yourself into being of service to others, and I promise you, your own troubles will feel lighter. You are so much stronger than you know, Ankit. There is a resilience in you that will see you through the toughest of times. Trust it. Trust yourself." Through his tears, a bittersweet smile bloomed on Ankit's face. His daddy was still teaching him, still guiding him, still loving him, even from beyond the grave. He would carry these words in his heart for the rest of his days. He was just about to fold up the letter when he noticed a postscript at the bottom of the page. "P.S. Take good care of the old scooter, won't you? It served me well. Just remember, my boy, heroes aren't always the ones you expect." Ankit frowned slightly, puzzled. What an odd thing to add. Of course he would take care of the Vespa. It was his most treasured link to his grandfather. He had moved it to his uncle's garage to keep it safe and preserved. But why the cryptic line about heroes? Not for the first time, Ankit wondered if his grandfather had known more than he ever let on. He had a feeling there was no figuring it out now, though. He tucked the precious letter into his shirt pocket, directly over his heart. He would read it every day, draw strength from it. He would make his daddy proud. Gazing around the empty study one last time, Ankit squared his shoulders and turned to leave, ready to walk into the next chapter of his life. Little did he know that chapter would begin sooner and more dramatically than he ever could have imagined. That his life was about to irrevocably change. And that old scooter? It was the key to it all. Delhi, 2005. Diwali was just days away, but for Ankit and his family, there would be no celebrations this year. They were in the prescribed one-year period of mourning after his grandfather's passing. At most, his mother said, they would light a few diya and say some prayers. Firecrackers, new clothes, sweets, and parties were out of the question. It suited Ankit just fine. Diwali had always been his daddy's favorite festival, and the thought of marking it without him was unbearable. He was content to simply go through the motions this year. So when his mother asked him to go to the market to buy the clay lamps and other prayer items, he agreed readily. Between his college classes and grueling practice sessions at the sports academy where he was training for the national cricket team, he was hardly home these days anyway. Perhaps the busy market would take his mind off things. But the crowds at Sarojini Nagar that evening were overwhelming. Ankit was hot, tired, and thirsty. All he wanted was to get this shopping over with and go home to his misery. That's when he spotted the juice stall. A perfect, he thought, just what he needed. A tall glass of something cold and refreshing. Ankit wove through the crowd and placed his order, watching as the vendor cranked the juicer. As he stood there waiting, his eyes drifted lazily over the vibrant chaos of the bazaar. The vendors hawking their wares, the girls giggling over bangles and bindis, the mouth-watering scent of a nearby chaat stand. And then he saw it, a flash of green in a sea of color. He froze, drink forgotten. Couldn't be. It wasn't possible. He blinked hard, shook his head, but there was no mistaking it. There, parked just a few feet away, was his grandfather's scooter. That unmistakable celadon green, those bold silver letters proclaiming Sarvagia on the front panel. An icy chill shot down Ankit's spine. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. The scooter had been locked away in his uncle's garage for a year. He had put it there himself, covered it lovingly with a tarp. No one could have taken it out. And even if they had, what were the chances of it turning up here now, today of all days? In a daze, Ankit stumbled forward as if pulled by an invisible string. His eyes never left the scooter as he pushed through the throngs of people. Just a few more steps and he would reach it, touch it, confirm with his own hands that it was real. Boom! A deafening blast knocked Ankit off his feet, sending him flying. He crashed to the ground several meters away, the breath knocked out of him. Ears ringing, vision swimming. He looked up and to his horror saw the market erupt into flames and screams. Thick black smoke belched into the sky as the fire raged. Blood and debris were everywhere. Charred bodies and severed limbs littered the ground. Agonized wails cut through the sound of crackling flames. Not a minute ago, this had been a bustling, colorful bazaar full of life and laughter. Now it was a hellscape, an orgy of carnage and destruction. The acrid tang of burning metal and flesh scorched Ankit's nostrils, making his gorge rise. The juice stand where he had been waiting was now a blackened hole edged by flames. There was no sign of the vendor. With a lurch of nausea, Ankit realized that if he had still been standing there, that would have been him. Shaking uncontrollably, he turned around wildly, searching for the scooter. The sight of that blessed green machine had saved his life, pulled him away from the stall just before the explosion hit. But it was nowhere to be found. The spot where it had been parked was now empty, not even a sign that it had ever been there at all. Ankit's knees gave out and he collapsed onto the bloody ground. What was happening? Was he losing his mind? Around him, the market burned as anguished cries of the injured rent the smoky air. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Ankit squeezed his eyes shut as shock and denial gave way to a single stark realization. A ghost had just saved his life. The days after the bombing passed in a surreal haze for Ankit. He moved through them in a state of numb disbelief, functioning on autopilot. Sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that market, back in that moment before his world exploded into fire and blood and unfathomable horror. And always, at the center of it all, was that impossible green scooter. He scoured the newspapers for any mention of it, watched and re-watched the news coverage of the attack till he could recite the eyewitness accounts verbatim. No one said a word about an old Vespa parked amidst the devastation. It was as if it never existed. Had it all been in his head then? Some trauma-induced hallucination conjured up by his distraught mind? For a few merciful days, Ankit managed to convince himself that was the case. That exhaustion and grief had made him see something that simply wasn't there. But deep down, he knew better. That scooter had been as real as the glass of juice in his hand, the cobbled stones under his feet. He hadn't imagined the shiny Sarvagia lettering or the faded green paint job. It had been there, as solid and tangible as his own beating heart. 43 dead, dozens more injured, the papers said. He should have been among them, would have been, if not for his grandfather's trusty old scooter mysteriously appearing out of nowhere to spirit him out of harm's way. Nothing else made sense, no matter which way he tried to rationalize it. The locked garage, the distance between Delhi and his uncle's town, the sheer improbability of it all. There was no logical explanation. But how do you wrap your head around a ghostly visitation? How does one reconcile cold, hard facts with the utterly fantastical? Ankit felt like he was losing his grip on reality, unmoored in a world that had stopped making sense. So 5 days after the bombing, he found himself on a bus back to his uncle's town, desperate for answers. He had to see that scooter, had to reassure himself it was still safely ensconced in the garage where he had left it. Only then could he begin to trust his own mind again. The hours dragged by as the bus trundled along the dusty highway. Ankit stared unseeingly out the window, his stomach churning with a mix of dread and anticipation. He didn't know what he would do or how he would cope if the scooter wasn't there. The thought alone made him break out in a cold sweat. It was dusk by the time he finally reached his uncle's house. The familiar old bungalow with its huge banyan tree and sprawling garden usually filled him with comfort and nostalgia. But today, it looked foreboding somehow, like it was guarding secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. He went through the motions of greeting his aunt and uncle, fielding their concerned questions about his health and state of mind. Yes, he was coping as well as could be expected. No, his parents hadn't wanted him to travel so soon, but he had insisted. He would only be staying the night. He just needed to check on something. Before they could press him further, Ankit excused himself and headed for the garage. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it, his mouth bone dry. The keys felt heavy and cold in his clammy palm. This is it, he thought wildly as he reached for the lock. The moment of truth. With a deep breath, he turned the key and pushed open the creaky door. And there it was, exactly as he had left it a year ago. The green Vespa sat there innocently, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Clearly, it hadn't moved an inch since Ankit had parked it here after his grandfather's death. Relief crashed over him in a tidal wave, so intense it made his knees weak. He sagged against the door frame, a shaky laugh escaping his lips. He wasn't crazy. It had been a figment of his shell-shocked imagination after all. The scooter was here, not in Delhi. He could lay that particular demon to rest. Except a niggling sense of wrongness still plagued him, a splinter in his mind he couldn't dislodge. If it had all been in his head, why did it feel so viscerally real? The green paint, the silver stickers. The stickers. With a sudden jolt, Ankit straightened up. He had to check the stickers. In his mind's eye, he could still see that distinctive Sarvajia gleaming under the Delhi sun. Heart in his throat, Ankit walked over to the scooter and crouched down, swiping at the cobwebs to get a clear view of the front panel. And then he saw it. The front panel was bare. The stickers were gone. Not a trace of adhesive residue left behind. It was as if they had never been there at all. Ankit rocked back on his heels, mind reeling. That wasn't possible. Those stickers had been on there for over a decade. They wouldn't have just fallen off unbidden. His grandfather's voice echoed in his head. That strange postscript from the letter. Heroes aren't always the ones you expect. Was this what he had meant? Had his daddy known somehow that this would happen? That his beloved scooter would gain a life of its own and come to Ankit's rescue in his darkest hour? It defied belief, spat in the face of every rational thought. But what other explanation was there? The impossible truth stared Ankit in the face with undeniable clarity. This scooter, this humble green Vespa, was no ordinary machine. It was something more, something magical, a final gift and guardian from a grandfather to his grandson. Tears pricked at the corners of Ankit's eyes as he rested his forehead against the cool metal, feeling closer to his daddy than he had in a long time. "Thank you," he whispered, "for watching over me." He knew people would think him crazy if he ever spoke of this. It hardly mattered. Some truths didn't need to be validated by others. They just needed to be believed deep in one's bones. Ankit straightened up, his mind clearer than it had been in days. He would go back to Delhi, back to his life. He would mourn those lost in the attack, do what he could to help the survivors. But he would never forget. And if he ever found himself lost or afraid, he knew he could come back here, to this dusty old garage, back to the hero that would always watch over him. Reverently, Ankit covered the scooter back up,